And she used to be pretty, but now she's just pretty fucked up. Oh, pretty fucked up. Yeah, pretty fucked up now. Oh, she used to be pretty, but now she's just pretty fucked up.
I gotta sing the Doom song now. Doom, doom, doom.
I touched on the green running thing yesterday, but this is of course part of a bigger, ongoing, for what seems like forever, conversation about representation and diversity. Well, diversity of everything except ideas in gaming. I think it's obvious that you can't get to a position of equality by treating people unequally. Some people disagree, and they're welcome to, I suppose. Doesn't seem like we're getting anywhere actually, making the ethical discussions with each other. I guess all revolutionaries become tyrants in time, and that's just the way it goes. But I was curious to find out what the hard data actually was, so I decided to investigate. This is incredibly difficult for a huge number of reasons, which I'll get into in a moment. But what I decided to do was to try and establish what a fair and representative amount of women, in this case, in gaming companies would be, and whether that level of representation is present in RPG companies. And this is incredibly difficult to do, but I tried. I acknowledge that there's all kinds of flaws in what I've done, all kinds of issues and problems, but it's the best possible way that I could see to go ahead with it. To declare my biases, I am an egalitarian and a libertine and a left libertarian. So I think everyone should be treated the same and everyone should be given the same shake. That means I'm opposed to affirmative action because that's just another kind of bias. It means I think women are strong and capable and tough and capable of competing on an even playing field. And I don't think things should be biased in their direction. I don't think you can remove bias and prejudice and so on from a system by deliberately pumping more bias and prejudice into that system. I think that just creates resentment and prolongs the issue. And various studies into this back me up. Check the Harvard Business Review, which I linked in the previous video. I believe some people are complaining that's very specifically to do with big business practices, but the things that it talks about there are much more applicable on a larger level, particularly the way people react to this kind of forced diversity quotas and so on. I'm anti-feminist. That will alarm a lot of people, I'm sure. I don't know if any new people will be watching these videos, but you probably think of feminism as being a movement for the equality of women, and it probably was some time ago. Modern feminism I do not see in that light. I see it as an authoritarian, censorious, prudish, anti-sex, anti-free expression, anti-liberty movement. You can disagree with me, but that's the basis upon which I view and oppose feminism. So if you don't agree that your feminism is that, then maybe we don't disagree. But that's how I see it. That's how I see it in the media. That's how I see it in academia. That's what I see going on in the way it disrupts and shuts down discussions and expression on media like this, and so on, with false flagging and censorship and abuse of terms of service and everything else. And in academia and the kinds of bullshit that it spreads, like patriarchy theory, objectification theory, all the rest of it. All of that I see as a massive threat to people's freedom, and that's the basis upon which I object to it. So that's where I'm coming from. If you think feminism just means men and women should be equal, I agree with you 100%. It's probably just tactics that we disagree on. But that's the slant that I'm coming at this from. I also think that, particularly with reference to role-playing games and the culture around that, we were much more equal and egalitarian during the 90s. And that's when we saw a massive influx of women into gaming via White Wolf's storyteller games and Mind's Eye Theatre, LARP and similar things like that. I don't think we've seen a similar influx since. And when you look back at Vampire and its attendant games, they were mature, adult, sexually themed often games that were otherwise fairly traditional kinds of games in a lot of ways in terms of system and so on. So make of that what you will. in order to reach my conclusions here, I have had to draw on some rather old and some rather unreliable sources, so everything that I say should be taken with a gigantic pinch of salt. I'm just doing my best with what's available. So what I've used to come to these conclusions, I've had to go back to the only mass survey of the RPG audience that has ever existed and been published, and that is unfortunately a nearly 20-year-old marketing survey by Wizards of the Coast when they were approaching doing 3rd edition. So that was around 1999, if I remember correctly. I don't have it up on my screen right now, I just have my notes. So that surveyed a very large number of gamers for demographics, spending, and other information. So it's out of date. Representation of women in gaming has probably gone up since then, but I'm not so sure, because like I said, the 90s was probably the height of women in gaming. Now, I didn't use other available sources like convention attendance for what I believe are good reasons. You may reject those, but gaming conventions have become more than just about RPG games, and here I'm interested in RPG games and RPG companies. I wanted to get to that specifically. Gaming conventions over the last 5 to 10 years have become less and, well, longer than that even, have become less and less just about RPGs. You know, the whole card game explosion previously meant that you get a lot more card gamers, competitive card gamers, board gamers, and so on at them. You now get cosplayers, computer games are represented, you know, geek media as a whole, cosplay, all of that massively distorts the figures. I want to get at RPGs and RPG companies. I don't want this broader picture. I'm after something much more specific. So I'd have to go back to much older data, even if I was going to use convention statistics. And I don't think convention statistics are particularly representative either. People who go to conventions are not representative of the broader, you know, of the broader gaming public, and that's the broader gaming community is the thing I want to see whether it's represented. So I rejected that. Now, figuring out who works for gaming companies and what their gender and so on is incredibly difficult. Most companies do not publish that kind of information. I couldn't find that kind of information published about any of the major RPG companies that there are. So I selected what I considered to be the largest game companies. So I went to Wizards, Paizo, and Fantasy Flight. I wanted a separate one to look at with Fantasy Flight because they do these other kinds of games as well. You know, the board games and all the rest. I mean, the Wizards and so on do as well. Paizo, less so, but you know, it's these are the big companies in the RPG arena. So those were the ones I wanted to look at. But they don't publish any of this information. So the only method I had to determine how the gender breakdown of their companies was to go to LinkedIn. And you can't search on gender on LinkedIn, and title field is for company title. So what I had to do was to search for anyone who had ever worked for that company and click through laboriously and make calls on what gender each person was. And some people don't have that kind of information, don't have profile pictures or whatever. There's false profiles on LinkedIn that are assigned to random companies. So there's problems and flaws in that data. I tried to limit it to the ones that seemed definite to me, but I had to make a judgment call. And the ones that were indeterminate, I just had to ignore. But hopefully the proportions there make sense. Another flaw in this information is that, as with tech companies that often claim quite high female employment, you may find that the women who are employed in these game companies are not employed at the design level, and you may find, you know, they're bulking the numbers up with receptionists or administration staff or whatever. That didn't seem to be the case to me going through these, you know, by hand. But it's a valid objection. It's a valid flaw in the data if you have these kind of criticisms. So to see what kind of representation there should be, I had to look at very old marketing data, and to see what kind of representation there is, I went through LinkedIn by hand and had to make personal judgment calls, which my bias may have affected. So what would a fair degree of representation look like? Some people might say that you ought to see a 50-50 split, the same as the population, but we're not talking about the general population, we're talking about a subset, a subculture. This might be slightly controversial to some of you, but I do not think that any hobby, particularly necessarily, has equal appeal to people on the basis of gender. I think there are female-dominated hobbies, I think there are male-dominated hobbies. We can agree or disagree upon the reasons why these might be dominated by one gender or the other, and the average, the typical, the bell curve says absolutely nothing about individuals. So I don't think there are male hobbies and female hobbies. I think there are male-dominated hobbies and female-dominated hobbies. And we can argue about the reasons why that is. That's outside the scope of this particular discussion and what I'm trying to get to. So, for example, I would not expect equal male representation in crochet or knitting or decoupage or Ann Summers parties or whatever else you care to mention. And I wouldn't expect female equal representation in home mechanics, kit cars, ham radio operators, train spotting, things like that. I would expect there to be women in there, and I expect them to be as good and whatever else as the men, but I would not expect there to be as many of them. And again, we can disagree on the reasons of that, nature versus nurture, whatever, outside the scope of what I'm trying to get to here. It's a different discussion. So in order to decide what a fair level of representation is, what could I look at? Well, the only thing I could look at is, okay, how many women are in the hobby? And this is difficult information to get at, as I've noted previously. I think there's problems with the kinds of ways that you might find out. You could look at, you could run an online poll, but that's likely to be self-selecting and biased. You could look at convention attendance, but conventions are not really just RPG conventions. Though, and this is purely anecdotal, I have done quick gender headcounts at the last 5 to 10 conventions I've ever been at, though, and I haven't been for a couple of years due to illness. But the kind of representation that I saw at places like Dragon Meet and IndieCon is in line with the conclusion that I've come to at the end of all this, if you think that's worth anything. It's purely anecdotal, and it's a tiny sample of relatively small UK conventions. So, though I did go to a convention in the US and saw the same kind of representation there. So, but anyway, that's purely anecdotal. Okay, so what could I look at to figure out what kind of representation at the company level would be? This is where I had to go to the old Wizards of the Coast survey. And the old Wizards of the Coast survey, again, was conducted in 1999, so it's well out of date information. But countering that, it was at the height of the whole storyteller boom, the Mind's Eye Theatre boom, the LARPing boom of the 90s. So I think things have probably crept up a bit, but not that much. I think we've probably shed quite a few people, we've kept quite a few people. So, you have to kind of fudge it a bit. Their survey found that of regular D&D players, this is the other problem with this survey, it's purely for D&D, which probably has slightly less appeal for women, but there you go. They found that 19% of the regular D&D audience were women. This was in 1999, and it was only for D&D. 19%. Call it 20. 1 in 5 players of D&D in 1999-2000 were women. Okay, that gives us a baseline to work from. Not a hugely accurate one. There's all kinds of problems with this. I I acknowledge that. I'm just using what's available to try and get to a conclusion. So I guess we're kind of going to be looking at somewhere between that 19% to about 25% would be where we'd be at with the amount of women in the general audience for role-playing games. But there's some other information that's pertinent, I think, from this survey, and that was that women tended to spend less money on D&D. Now, this could happen for a number of reasons. Probably all of them are a factor, but I think part of that is probably that for various reasons, women were less likely to be the dungeon master in D&D games. And I suspect, this is all speculative, but I suspect that the pool of people that go on to work in role-playing, to start their own companies or to become game designers or whatever else, I suspect that that pool is drawn from dungeon masters more than otherwise. So I reckon that of that 19% that's female, quite a few of those were not regular games masters, and so were less likely to go on and get into design and so on. Now so again, it's a separate discussion as to why that might be, or even why women might have less money to spend on their hobbies. But I think that does narrow the pool. So as a very sort of baseline, crude stat, what I'm going to be looking for as a fair level of representation is 20 to 25%. Okay. Again, you may disagree with all of the stuff leading up to this, but this is my process of thought, and I'm acknowledging that there's problems with it. Okay then, so what did I find? So I went to LinkedIn, I put in the name of the company, brought up their profile, and clicked through, in some cases 800 people tallying up their gender by eye and sometimes by guesswork, and otherwise putting them into a pool of neutral people and leaving them out. This was incredibly laborious and tedious, so I hope people appreciate it. Now, I'm not going to name and shame or name and praise any particular company. I'm just going to give you the broad range of statistics. But I looked at recognizable company names, people sizable enough to have profiles on LinkedIn. For example, Paizo and Wizards of the Coast as the big market leaders, Fantasy Flight, Green Ronin, others that you may have heard of. Okay, so what did I find? I found that women are represented in these companies at 20 to 25% of the overall staff at those companies, which is the level of representation one would expect to see if these companies are representative of the role-playing audience. Few other things to note, besides all the flaws that I've already mentioned. This includes a lot of freelancers, and a lot of freelancers have worked for multiple companies. So this might be one woman represented working for all of these. That happened with a lot of illustrators in particular. Some writers work for a lot of different people. Some seem to find their niche working for a particular company. But artists are whores. They work for anybody. So you need to take that into account as well. But I left the freelancers and so on in because the RPG industry is so heavily reliant on part-timers, hobbyists and freelancers. So that's reflective of the state of the industry and the hobby as a whole. But what I found was that representation in RPG companies is 20 to 25%, which is about what I would expect if it was representative. Even with the old data, thinking about how long it filters through and to really build a career in something like this, yeah, that seems to be about right. Well, your mileage may vary, but obviously I take this to support my conclusion that gaming is, and has been for a very long time, a very open and inclusive industry. at the hobby level, at the industry level, at all levels. It's just that it appeals more, for whatever reason, to dudes. We can fight and argue over why that is, whether we should be working harder to make gaming more appealing to women, whether we can make gaming more appealing to women, what kind of costs and decisions and design and art and so on stuff would help or hinder, or whether any of them could. We can argue about that all day long, but given the state of the gaming audience, the representation at the business level is appropriate, it's proportionate, it's accurate, it may even be slightly over and above what we see in the audience. And that wouldn't surprise me with the whole diversity virtue signaling thing going on as we're seeing at Green Ronin. It wouldn't surprise me at all if we saw a disproportionately high number of women being employed at companies, or disproportionate number of other minorities being employed at gaming companies, because I guess on a marketing level it's become important to show that you're progressive rather than to actually be progressive, I suppose. And if I was a woman or a minority, in some ways I guess I am a minority, at any of these companies, I would be concerned about being a diversity hire. I would want to be hired because of my talent, such as it is, and I would feel patronised. But I can't see any flaw with what companies are doing, especially now that I've looked at least what passes for hard data, and I acknowledge that there's a huge series of problems with the data, but it's all we have to go on, and I think 20 to 25% is at least ballpark. If I remember correctly, the gamer audience for video games, discounting social games, casual games, is about 1/3 women. I don't think we'd ever get role-playing games higher than that, even if we pulled out all the stops, even if tabletop gaming had as high a profile and so on as video gaming. I still don't think we'd ever really manage to achieve an inclusion rate above that. So there is room to improve this, but I think it's about the profile of gaming as a whole and its ubiquity in a similar way to the way it is with video games. Especially when I look back at the 90s and what made Vampire and so on so successful, it was not the kind of things that people are trying to push for the sake of diversity and inclusion now. In many ways, it's the exact opposite that attracted more women into the hobby in that period. It was mature themes, it was sexuality, it was as well more social interaction in the form of LARPs and so on. So that's a success in the past that we can look at. But I don't think this kind of militant forced diversity, I don't think this kind of censorship and moralizing is a way to expand the audience to any real degree, and it certainly is a way to piss off and alienate a lot of your core audience. So little surprise what I found supported my original position, but I've tried to acknowledge the flaws, I've tried to acknowledge my bias, and I've tried to be as objective as possible. But in the end, the conclusion is things are pretty much fine. Zang.